The first timber was a lie. It weighed 170 pounds, a dry, seasoned pine log he had milled himself, and it told his shoulders and back a story of impossible, singular weight. Elias shifted the load, the rough bark scraping against the canvas of his coat, and took another step down the gentle slope toward the dark maw in the earth. His boots slipped on loose scree. Beside him, a great shaggy dog named Boulder whined softly, his intelligent eyes fixed not on Elias, but on the cave itself, as if questioning the sanity of feeding it so much good wood. Elias grunted, a sound of effort, not of answer. He knew what the dog was thinking. He knew what the whole valley was thinking. He reached the entrance, a wide black smile in the hillside, and carefully lowered the timber to the ground beside a growing stack. He had made this trip 17 times since sunup, and the muscles in his thighs quivered with a fatigue that was becoming a familiar friend. The air was cold, carrying the sharp promise of October frost, but sweat traced a path down his spine. He straightened up, pressing his hands into the small of his back, and looked out over the valley. From here, he could see the patchwork of farms, the thin ribbon of the county road, and the distant steeple of the church in Harmony Creek. It was a world bathed in the clear, golden light of autumn. His world was here, at the edge of darkness. A horse's nicker broke the silence. Elias turned to see his nearest neighbor, Mr. Abernathy, reining in his mare at the top of the slope. Abernathy was a man carved from the local granite, his face a roadmap of harsh winters and disappointing harvests. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed alarmingly close to his horse's hoof. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen," Abernathy called down, his voice a gravelly rumble. He didn't bother with a greeting. "You've been hauling lumber to this godforsaken hole for a month. What in blazes are you doing, boy?" Elias wiped his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. He looked at the pile of wood, then back at the old farmer. "Building my home," he said. The words were quiet, swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. Abernathy barked a laugh, a dry, rattling sound. "A home? In a lava tube? Son, that's a tomb, not a home. It'll be damp as a grave and twice as dark. You'll catch your death of lung fever before the first real snow." He shook his head, a gesture of profound pity. "Your father was a sensible man. Your grandfather, well, he had his ideas. Looks like you got the worst of him." Elias said nothing. He had his grandfather's journals, leather-bound and filled with elegant script and precise drawings. They were not the ramblings of a madman. They were the careful observations of a student of the earth. The journals spoke of geothermal stability, of the planet's deep, constant warmth. They spoke of shelter from the wind, a wind that could strip a house of its heat in a single night. "You can't heat a cave, boy," Abernathy continued, warming to his lecture. "The rock'll just suck the warmth right out of your fire. You'll burn every stick of wood in this county and still freeze. Wait until winter. You'll see." It was a phrase Elias was beginning to hear often. Wait until winter. Mr. Gable, who owned the lumber mill and half the town, had said it with a dismissive wave of his hand. Mrs. Gable had said it with a worried frown, offering him the spare room in their large, drafty house. Elias had politely refused. He had a plan. This was his home. He picked up the end of another timber. Boulder nudged his hand with a wet nose, a silent vote of confidence. "I have a plan," Elias said, more to the dog than to the man on the horse. Abernathy just shook his head again and clicked his tongue, urging his mare back toward the road. The sound of her hooves faded, leaving Elias alone with the wood, the cave, and the work. He dragged the log into the darkness. The temperature inside the tube dropped 20 degrees immediately, but it was a still, dry cold, not the biting, wind-driven cold of the outside world. The air smelled of ancient stone and clean earth. Farther in, some 100 feet from the entrance, the temperature would stabilize. The journals promised it. At a depth of 50 feet, the Earth maintains a constant temperature year-round. His grandfather had written that on page 1. The Earth provides its own blanket. The first task was the floor. Abernathy was right about one thing: a dirt floor would be a disaster. The journals showed a raised platform, a wooden deck built on stone piers that would allow air to circulate underneath, preventing moisture from wicking up from the volcanic rock. For 2 weeks, Elias did nothing but haul and place stones, leveling them with a precision that bordered on obsession. He built 24 piers, each 3 feet high, arranged in a perfect grid that would support the foundation of his small, one-room cabin within the cave. The work was brutal. His hands, already calloused, split and bled. He cleaned them each night with coarse soap and cold water, watching the blood swirl down the drain of the basin in his temporary tent pitched near the entrance. Boulder would watch him, head on his paws, his breathing a steady rhythm in the quiet tent. The dog never tried to enter the tube without him. He seemed to understand it was a place of work, a place of transformation. When Elias emerged at dusk, covered in dust and grime, Boulder would greet him with a frantic tail and a happy bark, as if he had returned from a long journey. Once the piers were set, he began laying the floor joists. Each 12-foot beam had to be carried into the tube, hoisted onto the piers, and leveled. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the yellow glow of his 2 lanterns. Their light cast long, dancing shadows on the curved walls of the tube, making the space feel both immense and intimate. The silence was profound, broken only by the scrape of wood on stone, the thud of his hammer, the sound of his own breathing. He was building a ship in a bottle of rock. One afternoon, while he was wrestling a particularly heavy joist into place, a different voice echoed from the entrance. "Hello?" It was a woman's voice, clear and hesitant. Elias froze, his muscles screaming in protest. He turned to see a silhouette against the bright opening. As she stepped inside, letting her eyes adjust, he recognized Lena, the daughter of the man who ran the general store in town. She was holding a canvas sack. "Your order," she said, her voice a little shaky in the strange acoustics. "Pa was busy, so I brought it out." "Thank you," Elias said. He climbed down from the floor frame, wiping his hands on his trousers. Lena's gaze went past him to the strange wooden skeleton rising from the cave floor. Unlike the others, she didn't laugh or shake her head. Her eyes were wide with genuine curiosity. "Mr. Abernathy says you're building a house in here." "I am." "Why?" she asked. It wasn't a challenge, just a question. Elias hesitated. He wasn't used to explaining himself. He preferred to let the work speak for him. But her tone was different. He found himself wanting to answer. "The ground," he said, gesturing to the rock walls. "It stays the same temperature, around 50 degrees, no matter how cold it gets outside. The wind can't get in here." He pointed up. "This is 40 feet of solid rock. Nothing is getting through that." She walked closer, her boots making soft sounds on the dusty floor. She ran a hand along one of the joists he had just placed. "And the wood? Isn't it damp?" "The floor is raised," he explained, pointing to the stone piers. "Air moves underneath. It will stay dry." He found himself reciting lines from the journals. "The structure must breathe. It must be a guest in the rock, not a prisoner of it." Lena looked at him, a small smile on her face. "My grandmother used to say something like that about her root cellar. She said the earth keeps things honest." She held out the sack. "There's fresh bread in there, too. Ma insisted." He took the bag, their fingers brushing for a moment. Her hand was warm. Tell her I said thank you. I will, she said, her eyes still scanning the strange construction. It's ambitious. She said the word with respect, not scorn. As she turned to leave, she paused at the entrance. I hope it works. It'll work, Elias said quietly. Her visit marked a change. The work was still lonely, but it no longer felt entirely isolating. He thought of her question, of the simple, honest curiosity in her eyes. It was a stark contrast to the pity and mockery he got from everyone else. It was fuel. He finished the subfloor and began on the walls. The design from the journals was ingenious. The cabin walls were not to touch the sides of the lava tube. He left a 2-foot gap all the way around, creating an insulating pocket of still air. The rock would keep that trapped air at a steady 50 degrees, and the cabin's own stove would only have to heat the small, well-insulated interior space, not the entire cavern. It was a simple principle of thermal mass and insulation, but on this scale, it felt like a revelation. Hauling the finished wall frames into the cave was the hardest part yet. He built them in sections outside, then had to maneuver them through the entrance and hoist them into place. One evening, a heavy section slipped from his grasp. He tried to catch it, but it was too heavy. The corner caught his leg, pinning him against a stack of lumber. The pain was white-hot, electric. He cried out, and the sound was flat and dead in the vast emptiness. Boulder began to bark frantically, a sound of real panic. Elias lay there for a long time, breathing through the pain, the weight of the frame crushing his calf. The lantern cast a weak circle of light around him. There was no one to call for help. No one would even think to look for him here until his absence was noted in town, perhaps days from now. He was completely, utterly alone. The words of the skeptics echoed in his head. A tomb, not a home. Slowly, methodically, he began to work his leg free. He used a smaller piece of wood as a lever, gritting his teeth against the waves of agony. It took him nearly an hour. When he finally pulled his leg out, it was a swollen, bruised mess. He couldn't put any weight on it. He crawled, dragging himself out of the cave and back to his tent. Boulder licked his face, whining, a constant, worried presence. That night, as he lay in his sleeping bag, feverish with pain, he tended to the wound. He cleaned it with whiskey from a small flask and bound it tightly with strips of a clean shirt. He thought about quitting. He could go to the Gables, accept their offer. He could live in a normal house, with straight walls and neighbors close by. But then he thought of the journals, of the elegant, confident script. He thought of the deep, quiet stillness of the tube. He thought of Lena's curious smile. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a promise. It was a testament to a different kind of wisdom. He fell asleep not in despair, but with a renewed, hardened resolve. It would work. It had to. The leg healed slowly. He adapted his work, doing more cutting and assembly outside, limiting his trips into the cave. He built the roof trusses, designed with a steep pitch not for snow, for there would be no snow in here, but to encourage the circulation of warm air from the stove he planned to install. He sheathed the exterior of the cabin within a cave with thick pine boards, then began the most critical part of the entire project: insulation. He had bought every scrap of wool and cotton batting the general store had, but it wasn't enough. So he innovated, just as his grandfather would have. He spent a week harvesting dried moss and cattail fluff from the wetlands down by the creek. He packed it tightly between the wall studs, creating a thick, natural barrier against the cold. The Gables saw him gathering the cattails, and word got back to town that the poor, touched orphan boy was now building his house out of weeds. The laughter was a bit quieter now, tinged with a growing unease as the days grew shorter and the wind grew teeth. The last major piece of the construction was the entrance. He couldn't just leave the mouth of the cave open. He built a small, heavily insulated anteroom, almost like an airlock, with an outer door and an inner door. This would prevent the precious warm air from rushing out every time he entered or left. For the front of this structure, which faced the southern sun, he built a small greenhouse. He spent nearly all of his remaining money on thick panes of glass from a supplier 2 towns over. Mr. Gable had laughed out loud when he saw the crates. "A glass house for the winter. That boy will be an icicle by Christmas." Elias ignored him. He set the panes at a steep angle, designed to catch the low winter sun. Inside, he built beds for hardy greens and herbs. It was more than a source of food. It was a source of life, a defiant patch of green against the coming white. By mid-November, it was done. The cabin stood inside the lava tube, a snug wooden box in a vast stone hall. He installed a small, efficient cast-iron stove, running the insulated stovepipe up through the ceiling and then along the roof of the cave for nearly 200 feet to a natural fissure in the rock his grandfather had marked on a map. This long, horizontal run would allow most of the heat from the pipe to radiate into the cave's air before exiting, another small, clever detail from the journals. The first time he lit a fire in the stove, the effect was astonishing. Within an hour, the 12 by 16-foot room was a comfortable 70 degrees. The air outside the cabin, in the main tube, warmed by a few degrees. The stone walls seemed to soak up the gentle heat. He cooked a simple meal of bacon and eggs, the smell filling the small space with a sense of profound accomplishment. Boulder lay on a wool rug before the stove, sighing with a contentment that mirrored his own. He moved his few possessions from the tent into the cabin: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books, and the leather-bound journals. He sat at the table that night, the lantern off, the only light coming from the flickering flames visible through the stove's small glass door. The silence was absolute. The wind could be howling a gale outside, and in here there was only a deep, abiding peace. This was not a tomb. It was a sanctuary. Lena came out one last time before the snows began in earnest. She brought a package of seeds for the greenhouse. When she stepped through the anteroom and into the main cavern, she stopped, her mouth slightly open. The place had been transformed. The cabin glowed with warmth from its 2 small windows, a beacon of order and life in the ancient darkness. "Elias," she breathed, "it's a marvel." He invited her inside. She stepped into the warmth, and her shoulders, which had been hunched against the cold, immediately relaxed. She looked around at the smooth wooden walls, the neatly stacked firewood, the bookshelf. "It's warmer in here than in our parlor," she said, amazed. "The stove is very efficient," he said, understating the miracle of the design. She walked over to the window, which looked out not onto a landscape, but onto the curved, dark wall of the lava tube, lit faintly by the cabin's own light. "It feels safe," she said. It was the highest compliment she could have given. The first snows were light, a dusting that melted by noon. But the old-timers, the men like Abernathy, watched the sky with worried eyes. They watched the behavior of the deer coming down from the high country weeks earlier than usual. They watched the squirrels gathering pine cones with a frantic energy. "It's going to be a bad one," Abernathy told Elias one day on the road, his tone less mocking and more genuinely concerned. "You still have time to come down from that hole, boy. There's no shame in it." "I'll be fine," Elias said. "Are you prepared?" Abernathy grunted. "Been through 50 winters in this valley. My father's father built my house. It'll stand." He rode off, shaking his head. The storm arrived on the 3rd day of December. It did not come gently. The sky turned a bruised slate gray, and the wind began to moan through the pines. Elias stood in the glass of his greenhouse, watching the first flakes, thick and wet, begin to fall. Boulder stood beside him, a low growl rumbling in his chest. By nightfall, the world was gone. erased by a blinding curtain of white. The wind shrieked, a physical force that shook the thick glass of the greenhouse. But behind the inner door, in the cavern, the sound was a dull, distant roar. And inside the cabin itself, it was almost completely silent. He had 60 cords of firewood stacked against the far wall of the tube, enough for 2 winters. He had hundreds of pounds of flour, beans, and cured meats. The greenhouse was already sprouting lettuce and kale. He sat by his fire, reading one of his grandfather's books, while the greatest blizzard in a generation raged 100 feet away. He was not just surviving, he was comfortable. He felt a deep, quiet vindication. The storm lasted for 3 days. The snow fell without pause, piling in prodigious drifts. The wind never stopped. On the 3rd night, as Elias was banking the fire for bed, Boulder suddenly lifted his head from the rug, his ears perked. He let out a low, sharp bark. Elias froze. He listened. Over the muffled roar of the wind, he heard something else. A frantic, desperate pounding. It was coming from the outer door of the anteroom. He grabbed his heaviest coat and a lantern. Boulder was already at the inner door, growling. "Easy, boy," Elias said. He opened the inner door, stepping into the colder air of the cavern. The pounding was louder now, accompanied by a hoarse shouting that was mostly stolen by the wind. He unlatched the heavy outer door. It took all his strength to pull it inward against the pressure of the snow that had drifted against it. A figure stumbled in, collapsing onto the floor in a flurry of snow and ice. It was Mr. Abernathy. His face was caked in ice, his lips blue. He was shivering so violently his teeth chattered like castanets. "The roof," he gasped, his voice a raw whisper. "The weight of the snow, it just came down. The whole north side of the house, gone." Elias helped him up, half carrying the old man through the inner door and into the cabin. The wave of warmth that hit them was like a physical blow. Abernathy staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief as he looked around the small, warm, well-lit room. He stared at the stove, at the sleeping dog, at the bookshelf. "My God, boy," he whispered, his shivering slowly subsiding in the radiant heat. It's like summer in here." Elias sat him in a chair and wrapped him in a thick wool blanket. He gave him a steaming mug of coffee laced with a little whiskey. Abernathy drank it in greedy gulps, his hands shaking. "I thought I was a dead man," he said, his voice gaining some strength. "I was crawling for an hour, couldn't see a thing. Then I saw a light, a little faint glow. I didn't know what it was, I just aimed for it." He looked at Elias, his eyes filled with a dawning, profound understanding. "It was your greenhouse." Before Elias could reply, there was more shouting from outside. He went back to the door. This time, there were 3 of them: Mr. Gable, his wife, and their young son. Their fine motor car was buried in a drift a quarter mile down the road. They had been trying to reach the town for safety when the engine died. They were soaked through, their expensive coats providing little protection against the sheer ferocity of the wind. Mrs. Gable began to cry with relief when she stepped into the warmth. Mr. Gable, a man used to being in charge, looked utterly lost. He stared at the construction, at the stacked firewood, at the calm, prepared young man he had openly mocked for months. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He simply sank into the chair Elias offered him, his pride stripped away by the cold. They were the first, but not the last. Over the next 2 days, as the storm finally blew itself out, a trickle of refugees made their way to the strange light on the hill. The Miller family, whose farmhouse had lost its windows to the wind. 2 ranch hands who had been caught out checking on cattle. By the time the sun finally emerged, blinking weakly on a world transformed into a landscape of monumental white drifts. There were 11 people sheltered in Elias's home. They slept on the floor of the cabin, in the warmer parts of the main cavern, sharing blankets and food. The lava tube, the place Abernathy had called a tomb, had become an ark. When the storm broke, the silence was as shocking as the wind had been. The world outside was beautiful and terrifying. The snow was piled 15, 20 feet high in places. Entire homes were buried. The county road was gone. Harmony Creek was completely cut off. In the quiet aftermath, Abernathy walked slowly around the main cavern, touching the cool, dry rock of the walls, examining the clever ventilation system, the massive woodpile. He stopped in front of Elias, who was splitting kindling. The old farmer's face was a mixture of awe and shame. "I was wrong, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All my life, I thought I knew this land. I thought I knew how to live here. I knew nothing." He looked at the sturdy cabin. "This is the smartest built damn thing in the whole state. Your grandfather, he was a genius. And you listened." Mr. Gable approached, his own face humbled. "Elias," he said, using his first name with a respect he had never shown before. "We used your food, your firewood. I want to pay for all of it, for everything." Elias looked at the small community gathered in his shelter. He looked at Mrs. Gable, handing a piece of bread to one of the Miller children. "We're neighbors," he said. "That's all the payment I need." It took a week for the plows to reach them. In that time, the lava tube became the center of the world. The men, led by Abernathy, formed digging crews to check on other farms. The women, led by Mrs. Gable and Lena, who had arrived with the first rescue party, organized the food and supplies. Elias, in his quiet way, was at the center of it all. He showed them how the stove worked, where the best seasoned wood was, how to tend the greenhouse. He didn't give orders. He simply shared his knowledge. When the world reconnected, the legend of Elias's folly was replaced by the legend of Elias's ark. People came from all over the county to see it. They came not to mock, but to learn. They walked into the cavern, their voices hushed with reverence, and marveled at the simple, profound wisdom of the design. Elias, uncomfortable with the attention, would often just hand them one of his grandfather's journals. "It's all in there," he would say. The winter of the Great Blizzard became a landmark in the valley's history, a point from which all time was measured, before the blizzard and after. In the years that followed, things began to change. People started building deeper foundations, insulating their homes with more care, positioning their houses to be sheltered from the wind, not just to have the best view. Abernathy rebuilt his home using 3 principles he learned from Elias's grandfather's journals. Mr. Gable began selling lava tube-tested insulation at his mill. The ideas, once mocked, became the new conventional wisdom. Elias and Lena married the following spring, in a simple ceremony near the mouth of the cave. They built their life there, in the quiet dark. They expanded the cabin within the tube, adding 2 more rooms as their family grew. Their children grew up with the smooth, cool rock as one wall of their playground. They learned to read the weather not from an almanac, but from the feel of the air at the cave's mouth. Boulder grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his steps became slow and deliberate. He spent most of his days sleeping on the rug by the stove, the same rug he had claimed that first night. One autumn morning, 17 years after he had watched his master haul the first timber, he did not wake up. Elias carried his old friend outside and buried him beneath a young pine tree that grew near the entrance. He carved the dog's name into a smooth river stone to mark the spot. It was a changing of the guard, a quiet acknowledgement of time's relentless, gentle passage. Years turned into decades. Elias became the new old-timer, a man whose quiet words carried the weight of earned wisdom. He never boasted about what he had done. When people spoke of the great blizzard and how he had saved them, he would just nod and say, "The earth provides its own blanket. You just have to know how to use it." He taught his children and his grandchildren how to build, how to prepare, how to listen to the land. He outlived Abernathy. He outlived the Gables. He and Lena grew old together, their love a quiet, steady flame like the one in their cast-iron stove. One winter morning, in his 87th year, Elias passed away peacefully in his sleep. In the bed in the room in the cabin, in the home he had built with his own 2 hands. The entire valley came to his funeral. They buried him on the hillside, next to the weathered stone that marked Boulder's grave. They placed a simple granite marker over his own. It didn't list the dates of his birth or death. It had only 6 words carved deep into the stone, words suggested by Abernathy's great-grandson. "He showed us the way home." Long after he was gone, the home remained. His children, and then his grandchildren, lived within the rock, keeping the fire going. Every winter, when the winds howled and the snow buried the world in white, smoke would curl from the hidden chimney, a thin gray thread against the sky. It was a quiet signal, a testament to the boy who listened to the earth, a promise of warmth and safety, a legacy of light in the dark.